The cold in the basement rose through the gaps between the stone slabs underfoot, like invisible needles pricking one by one into Helmut Krause's bones. 16 years old, wrapped in a Volkssturm coat that hung too large on his frame, he crouched in the corner of a cellar beneath a half-collapsed apartment building in Eisenburg. It was December 24th, Christmas Eve. There were no bells and no carols, only the occasional dull thump from far away. The Americans' combat engineers clearing the neighborhood, dealing with unexploded shells, booby-trapped stairwells, and the unstable remains of buildings that could still collapse without warning. The air down here had a stale, mineral taste. Smoke and wet plaster had seeped into the bricks and refused to leave. When Helmut shifted his weight, grit whispered under the soles of his boots, and the sound seemed loud enough to summon soldiers. Above, somewhere in the hollowed floors, the wind moved through broken window frames and made a thin, continuous moan. In the dark, the cellar felt less like a room than like the underside of the ruined city, a place where time had pooled and thickened. In his arms, he held a photo album. The cover had once been red cloth with a gilt title, but fire had blistered it into a black, cracked skin. The spine was warped. The pages inside had swelled from damp and then dried unevenly, so that the book resisted opening like a stiff joint. Ash smudged the corners. To anyone else, it would have looked like debris. To Helmut, it felt heavier than any rifle he had ever handled. He held it tight as if it were a life ring, and as if it were evidence about to be seized. In truth, it was both. The album's corners pressed into his chest in a rhythm that almost matched his heartbeat. A month earlier, he would have sworn that what he carried was faith. Germany's future, the honor he believed gleamed from the Hitler Youth uniform, the certainty that he belonged to something larger than his own small life. Now he was curled in the ruins of his hometown, holding nothing but fear. He feared the occupiers. He feared revenge from neighbors who had once nodded politely and now spat when they said the word Nazi. He feared his own memory, because it no longer lined up neatly with the slogans he had repeated. Most of all, he feared the album's frozen smiles, especially his own. He did not dare open it, yet the images burned behind his clenched eyelids all the same. A Christmas tree in 1938, candles truly lit and flickering, his mother in a ridiculous Santa hat, laughing with her arms around his father's neck. Then the picture jumped, blurred, and became 1943, himself the same age as now, but with eyes too bright, wearing a crisp Hitler Youth uniform, arm raised in a rigid salute. Behind him a wall of flags, behind that a crowd. Behind that, the roar of belief he had once mistaken for truth. He had once treasured that uniform photograph. A leader had told him it was a record of duty. His friends had admired it, slapped him on the shoulder, talked about their future in the Reich as if the future were a straight road. Now, the same photograph felt like a noose already looped, waiting only for someone else to pull. That photograph felt like proof beyond argument. The Americans would see it, understand it, and he could not force his mind to finish the thought. He could only imagine shouting, rifle butts, ropes, perhaps worse. He had prepared himself in a way that felt almost devout for suffering. He would be seen, he would be judged, and perhaps only through punishment could he find some fragment of meaning in everything that had collapsed. If he could be punished, then the story would end in a clean shape, guilt, sentence, payment, closure. Without that, he would have to carry everything forward, and he did not know how to do that. Above him came the scrape of boots on rubble, not the scattered footsteps of passers-by, but cautious, rhythmic movement. Every muscle in Helmut's body went taut. He stopped breathing. The sound paused directly overhead. A flashlight beam slanted down through the broken cellar entrance, stirring dust and the stink of smoke and char. The beam swept across his hiding place and stopped. "There's someone down there. Come out. Hands up. Let us see your hands." English. The voice was not loud. It carried fatigue, but also command, the kind of command that did not expect to be questioned. Helmut did not understand every word, but he knew come out in hands. He stayed frozen, clutching the album tighter. It was his last fortress, his last piece of order in a world that had become rubble. He could not decide whether to obey or to shrink deeper into the dark until he became part of the cellar. Civilian, probably scared, another voice said, also in English. The beam wobbled. Two figures blocked the pale light at the entrance. Muddy olive uniforms, steel helmets, rifles in hand. Their barrels hung low rather than pointing directly at him. But the threat needed no explanation. The older one had a lean face and an assessing stare, as if he were measuring a wall that might need to be breached. Sergeant Thompson. Helmut did not know the name then, but he would remember the face, a man trained to scan for danger and to move on. Thompson tipped his chin toward Helmut and said something to the younger soldier beside him. The younger soldier stepped forward half a pace and assembled a command from stiff German words. You, come out, hands up, now. Helmut's lips trembled. He tried to stand, but his legs went soft. Bracing against the wall, he edged out of the corner, never loosening his grip on the album. The movement drew an immediate response. Thompson's gaze locked on the object Helmut hugged to his chest. Civilian plus unknown package was a trained equation, potential explosive, potential weapon. Helmut understood the look even without understanding the language. It was the look of someone deciding how quickly he might have to kill. Put it down, slowly, on the ground. Thompson spoke quickly in English, his hands signaling clearly. The younger soldier echoed in German. Thing, put down, ground. Fear seized Helmut. Put it down. Put down his confession, the one thing that proved who he was, who he had been. He shook his head not in defiance, but in the reflex of confusion and terror. His arms tightened, pulling the album closer. The album was not a weapon, but he could not explain that, and he could not explain what it was without destroying himself. That tiny motion changed the soldier's posture at once. Thompson lifted his rifle a few inches. The younger soldier's shoulders rose with him. Helmut felt the air tighten, as if the cellar itself had become a spring under tension. Thompson's voice hardened. Last time, put it down, step back, hands over your head, or we treat you as a threat. The translation came a beat later, but the warning in the younger soldier's tone was clear. So this was the opening, Helmut thought, the trial. They would take it, see it, and he would be condemned. A numb relief slid under the terror. At least the waiting would end. At least he would no longer have to carry the question of what he deserved. He bent and set the album down on the rubble-strewn floor as gently as if laying an offering. Then he staggered back until his spine met the damp wall and raised his shaking hands. His fingers ached from holding them up. His wrists trembled. Thompson did not touch the album with his hands. He drew a narrow metal probe and approached as if it were a suspicious parcel. Helmut watched, helpless. Thompson checked the cover, spine, and edges for seams or wires, then slid the probe into the gap between cover and pages and pried carefully. Far off, another muffled blast sounded, and dust drifted again from the ceiling like dirty snow. Thompson lifted the charred cover with a bayonet tip and exposed the first page, a pre-war family photograph, a Christmas tree, his parents, himself as a child, smiling wide, warm lamplight in a peaceful living room. Helmut felt his throat tighten. That room no longer existed. His mother no longer existed. The photograph was a hole cut into the past. Thompson's eyes paused on it for less than a second. No change in expression. He flipped the page, his purpose clear, to check for thickened inserts, hidden layers, connections, anything that would turn a harmless-looking object into a kill box. Page after page turned at an even pace. His gaze swept the physical structure, not the pictures themselves. The images flashed under his hand: Helmut's first bicycle, his mother in the garden, his father in the study, and then the abrupt turn, the Hitler Youth uniform, parades, rallies, the standard shot with the raised arm, and fervor in the face. When Thompson reached the uniform page, Helmut nearly stopped breathing. That one. He waited for the glare, the accusation, the finger stabbing the photo, and a barked question in German or English. He waited for his life to split into before and after. Nothing happened. Thompson's eyes did not linger even a fraction. The probe pressed lightly along the photograph's edge to confirm there was no foreign object, and then the page flipped over. Thompson continued to check blank leaves in the back cover as if the image had not existed. Helmut's stomach lurched. He had not expected mercy, but this was not mercy. This was dismissal. "Fletcher," Thompson said without looking up, "about the thickness of my sister's wedding album. Harder cover." Fletcher, the younger soldier, kept his rifle aimed at Helmut, but as Thompson flipped pages, Fletcher's eyes caught the images in quick, involuntary glimpses. When the pre-war family tree appeared again near the back, Fletcher swallowed and muttered, very low, "Jesus, look at that tree, like the one in my folks' place before the war." The note of distant longing flickered and vanished. His gaze snapped back to Helmut and his trigger discipline. As if ashamed of having felt anything, Thompson straightened and stowed the probe. Clear, just a photo album burned. Pages stuck some. Into his radio he reported, "Initial sweep. 1 civilian located, male, juvenile, unarmed. 1 personal item, threat of explosive ruled out. Over." He turned to Fletcher. "Log it. Put it in the non-threat property box. Get him out with the others for transfer." Only then did Fletcher lower his rifle slightly. From his pack he pulled a grimy field log and a pencil. He walked to the album but did not pick it up right away. Instead, he nudged it with the toe of his boot to a cleaner patch of floor, crouched, and wrote a few lines. Location, Eisenburg, Sector 7, cellar. Item, photo album 1. Condition, fire damage. Pages stuck. Notes, no threat. Then he pinched the scorched corner between 2 fingers, lifted it, and carried it to an open crate marked temporary storage, non-threat. It landed with a light slap among chipped dolls, a dead clock, and waterlogged books. Helmut stared, the core of what he had feared, being seen, scrutinized, condemned by that uniform photograph, had been ignored completely. They had looked through it and yet not seen it. The non-personal, procedure-driven handling, rooted in threat clearance rather than moral judgment, hit him like a silent blow, scattering every script of trial and punishment he had rehearsed. The album he had treated as sacred or damning now lay in a heap of junk, reduced to a logged object, an item on a list. Something inside him protested. If they did not condemn him, then what did his guilt mean? If no one shouted and no one struck him, then the story did not end, it simply continued. Fletcher motioned him to follow. Helmut climbed the rubble slope out of the cellar. Outside was a street of ruins under heavy dusk. Several American trucks waited. Gaunt German civilians were gathered under a broken wall, guarded by other soldiers. Thompson spoke into his radio in a formal tone. "Area initial sweep complete. Several civilians located, threats cleared, unarmed. Some personal property logged and sealed. Request instructions for transfer. Over." Wind cut through the wreckage, lifting ash. Standing among the clustered civilians, Helmut listened to unfamiliar English words crackle through radio static. Civilian, unarmed, personal property, logged and sealed. He and his album, his terror, his guilt, had been compressed into a handful of neutral terms inside a vast, efficient, cold report. He looked up at Eisenburg's lead gray sky and understood for the first time that in the occupier's world, his personal history, his faith, his guilt, his need for redemption had not even entered the room. The truck jolted over rubble and frozen soil. The bed was packed with silent bodies. Cold air slipped through gaps in the canvas and stole the last warmth from his skin. Beside him, a woman held a baby that stared with eyes too large at the gray sky. Another man, gray-bearded and hollow-cheeked, stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. No one spoke. The silence was more suffocating than gunfire. It belonged to the interval after an old world has shattered and before a new one has taken shape. Helmut kept replaying the cellar scene, the probe testing the album, the boot nudging it, the casual words clear and non-threat. Each memory returned with the same baffling absence of judgment. He tried to interpret the words. Juvenile, unarmed, threat ruled out. They were labels that moved him from danger into a category of manageable. They were also, he realized, a kind of power, not the power to punish him, but the power to ignore him. Their destination was a vocational technical school outside Eisenburg that had not been entirely destroyed. The gymnasium had been requisitioned and converted into a temporary shelter and registration center. Broken high windows were boarded with planks. The vast room smelled of disinfectant, wet clothing, and exhausted bodies. Stoves improvised from fuel drums belched harsh smoke and provided limited heat. American soldiers stood at the entrance in the aisles and around desk enclosures that served as offices. Beds were not beds, but blankets on the floor, arranged in chalk-marked rectangles like a map of human storage. The process began at the door. Civilians were split into lines. A soldier pointed with his rifle barrel not as a threat, but as a pointer, moving people to the proper place. At a long table, an American clerk with glasses worked through thick forms and carbon paper. The scratching of pens became a kind of constant, like insects. Beside him stood a local German translator in an old suit, face drawn with fatigue. His tie was loose, his eyes red-rimmed, and he spoke as if he were reading from a script that had been forced into his mouth. "Name," the clerk said in English without looking up. The translator repeated in German. "Name?" "Helmut Krau," Helmut answered, his voice dry. He heard his name as if it were something that belonged to a different time. The questions came in a flat sequence: age, birthplace, last address, names, and whereabouts of immediate relatives, whether he had been armed, whether he had seen weapons, then whether he had belonged to the Nazi Party or any affiliated organizations. Helmut's heart tightened. He expected accusation, a sudden turning of the room into a court. He had prepared for that moment in his imagination. He would either deny and feel shame or confess and be punished. Instead, the clerk's pen simply hovered over the next blank. The translator repeated the words without emphasis, already glancing at the next person in line. The question was just another box. "No," Helmut said, almost a whisper. "Not a member." The clerk checked a box. No reaction, no follow-up. The pen moved on. The check mark landed on paper with no weight, as if it belonged to eye color or height. A cursory medical screening followed: temperature, wounds, skin. A cold stethoscope touched Helmut's chest, while the medic looked through him with professional distance. The medic's hands were quick, practiced, and impersonal. "Next," he said, and Helmut was sent on. He received a rough gray blanket, a numbered enamel bowl and spoon, and was directed to a chalk-marked section of the gym. Helmut sat on his blanket and watched the translator move between desks, repeating questions, translating orders. Men and women held their documents out like offerings. Some clutched bundles, some clutched nothing. The Americans stamped papers, scribbled notes, tied tags to objects. The machine ran. A thought rose, tentative and desperate. Perhaps a German could understand what he could not say to Americans. Perhaps a German could tell him what the album meant now in this new order. Perhaps there was a place for meaning somewhere between the clerk's boxes and the soldier's rifle. Hours later, he saw the translator slip toward a side door for a cigarette. Helmut followed to the entryway's colder quiet. Outside the door, the winter air was sharp. Inside, the gym's heat and smell pressed like a blanket. The translator leaned against the frame and lit his cigarette with hands that shook slightly. "Sir," Helmut began in German. The translator turned, irritation flickering, then settling into weary patience. "What do you need?" "I had an item, a photo album. The soldiers took it, they logged it," Helmut said. "What will happen to it? Will they look at what's inside?" The translator inhaled and exhaled smoke toward the gym's noise. "Non-threat personal property is inventoried and stored. It may be verified and returned later. Standard procedure." "But if the contents are special," Helmut pressed, lowering his voice. "Photographs from before." The translator studied him for a few seconds. Recognition passing behind his eyes, Helmut saw it. The translator understood exactly what kind of special he meant. He understood the danger of images, the danger of association, the fear of being seen as one thing and punished for it. Then the translator cut in, brisk, as if to close the subject before it opened. "The content is not important," he said, "unless it is a weapon, explosives, military maps, or obvious incitement. The process is the same. Inventory, seal, wait. They do not have time to read every civilian's family album." He put weight on family album, as if drawing a line Helmut should not cross, insisting on a category that could keep Helmut safe. "Go back. Do not make trouble." "The content is not important." The phrase struck Helmut harder than any threat. It was not forgiveness. It was disregard so complete it erased his chosen story of guilt and punishment. He returned to his corner, carrying the words like a stone that sank in his chest. If the content was not important, then his guilt was not important, at least not to the machine. His private terror had no official channel. Over the next 2 days, he watched the same pattern repeat. An old man begged for help locating his wife's small keepsake box, the last thing he said he had left of her. His hands shook as he described it. A wooden box with a carved lid, inside it letters in a small ring. An American NCO listened through translation, wrote the description on a clipboard, assigned a reference number, and promised it would be forwarded to the property section. The old man thanked him as if he had been given mercy, but what he had been given was only a process. Another man tried to submit a stamped document meant to prove his political innocence. It was placed in an envelope marked with his assigned number and filed without comment, as if political innocence were just another piece of paper to be stored. Helmut watched and began to see the machine's shape. The system received inputs, people, items, complaints, classified them, logged them, routed them, and produced outputs. Assigned places, basic rations, recorded claims. It did not judge the past. It managed only the present, the visible, the safe. His fear, his guilt, his rehearsed script of confession had no interface with it. Its questions were one-way and functional. Name, age, weapons, illness, address. Its answers were numbers, boxes, lists, and the dry phrase, standard procedure. At first, Helmut had wanted only to avoid judgment. When the seller did not produce the judgment he expected, he began to seek it, to crave a finished confession. anything to end the suspended state. Now he understood the more brutal truth. The machine had no place for confession from someone like him. He mattered only insofar as he could disrupt order or become a physical threat. Otherwise, he would be carried along as one more civilian body on a conveyor belt designed to move him from danger to containment, from containment to assignment, from assignment to whatever came next. On the third afternoon, a different American soldier entered the gym, younger and cleaner than the engineers, carrying a brown folder. The translator walked beside him. They spoke briefly with the NCO in charge, then headed toward Helmut. The translator's voice cut through the general murmur of the gym like a clerk calling a number. "Helmut Krause?" he asked. Helmut nodded, throat dry. "This is your property," the translator said in the same flat tone he had used for names and ages. A manila envelope emerged from the folder, standard issue, edges worn. On the front, black typing, name Krause. Helmut found Eisenburg, Sector 7, cellar, property number CP0127, item, photo album, 1 damaged. CP0127. The album had been translated into a code. The soldier held out the envelope but did not press it into Helmut's hand. Through the translator, he said, "Confirm the item. If correct, sign here." A small receipt form taped to the back held the same number and description with a signature line. The pencil offered was blunt, worn down like it had already served 100 signatures. Helmut took the envelope. He unclasped it and saw the familiar burned corner. He pulled the album out and, almost against his will, opened it. The page he landed on was the Hitler youth portrait, the boy's eyes bright, jaw set, certainty fixed like a mask. Helmut waited for a reaction, for anger, curiosity, disgust, anything. He waited for the world to recognize the photograph the way he recognized it. The soldier's gaze moved only between the album and the typed description, then returned to the signature line. He tapped the paper with the pencil. The translator said, "Just sign. It means you received it." No interrogation, no scrutiny. The system's interest was administrative closure, confirm, sign, file. It did not care what the album meant. It cared that the loop was closed. Helmut's dizziness returned, as if the floor had turned to sand. With stiff fingers he signed. The soldier glanced only to confirm there was a mark, tore off the receipt form, left Helmut the stub, and slid the original back into his folder. A nod, a turn away. The two men walked back to the NCO for final notes and did not look at Helmut again. The loop closed. That was all. Helmut returned to his corner and sat against the cold wall. The envelope lay across his knees, CP0127, stamped into his mind. It felt like an erasure. Pre-war Christmas candlelight, his mother's laughter, his father's hands, the uniform, the rallies, the terror in the cellar, compressed into a property number and a file. He had wanted the world to say, "This is what you are." Instead, the world said, "This is what you own. Here's the receipt." As dusk thickened and the stove flames threw restless shadows, he opened the album again slowly. This time he did not hunt for proof or danger. He looked. The pre-war family photo came first. Without the ideological glaze he had once laid over it, the details struck with raw force. His father's laugh lines, his mother's tilted head, his own grin missing a tooth, the real flames on the tree. The grief that rose was not for a nation or an ideal. It was for an ordinary afternoon he would never return to, for a mother's laughter he would never hear again, for the warmth of a hand on his shoulder. The pain was specific and private, too heavy for speech. He turned to the uniform photo. The boy there felt like a stranger shaped by an era's pressure and noise. Helmut had once been him. Now he could not fully claim him. Between the two versions lay not only defeat and rubble, but the experience of being processed, threat cleared, inventoried, returned, treated as a civilian owner of property CP0127 rather than as a sinner awaiting a tribunal. The system had not judged him, and in that refusal it dismantled the story he had built to make sense of himself by ignoring his identity as something significant. Hero, traitor, believer, criminal. It forced him into a smaller, more brutal truth. He was simply a person who had lived through an era and now had to live after it. The emotion in his chest swelled and then did not become tears. It settled into a deep, suffocating silence. Somewhere beyond the gym, another dull blast sounded as engineers cleared the city piece by piece. The outside world remained dangerous, but it was being made safe by an order that did not care about Helmut's private past. His own world had been altered, not by a verdict, but by a pencil that demanded a signature. After that, the days became plain. He rolled the envelope and album into his blanket and guarded them the way one guards a possession in a crowded room. He rose to whistles, lined up for black bread and ersatz coffee, accepted work assignments, stacked crates, hauled debris. The guards watched the space, not the soul. Their rifles stayed slung unless a boundary was crossed. The same desk enclosures swallowed the same kinds of requests and returned the same kinds of answers. When someone fought over a ration or tried to push ahead in line, the reaction was swift and procedural. A shouted command, a shove back into place, order restored. Now and then, distant blasts still rolled across the city, fewer than before but unmistakable. Each one reminded Helmut of the probe scraping the album's cover, of the bayonet tip lifting a page. The blasts and the inspection belonged to the same logic. Remove physical danger, restore passage, keep the machine moving. He began to understand the occupation not as a single act of victory, but as an endless series of small procedures, each one replacing chaos with a narrow lane of order. One afternoon, the shelter's public radio crackled with a translated announcement. Organized resistance in the Ruhr had largely ended. The occupation authority was taking over administration, restoring basic order, and preparing to identify and arrest war criminals and core Nazi personnel. The tone was official, without heat. A ripple of murmurs moved through the gym. Some people looked down. Some people looked up as if expecting a sudden reckoning to descend through the boarded windows. Helmut listened with a bowl of warm substitute coffee in his hands. The words war criminals and core Nazi personnel fell into him like stones. Yet the splash was distant. A month earlier he would have seized them and immediately placed himself under their shadow. Now the system that had already categorized him, civilian, unarmed, owner of CP0127, seemed to stand between him and those hard nouns like a buffer, not a pardon and not innocence, but a bureaucratic boundary. He had been processed as a different kind of problem, one to be managed and moved rather than hunted. At night he sometimes opened the album in the dimness. He did not try to force a coherent narrative out of it. He noticed the blank pages between photographs, the curled corner swollen by damp, the faint pencil date on the back of one picture, 1937.12.24, his mother's hand smudged by time, the dark stain inside the back cover, whose origin he could not name. The album's physical survival and damage began to feel as real as its images. It was a thing that had made it through, like him, scorched, warped, still present. On a later work detail, Helmut and other youths were sent outside to load bundles of German books and pamphlets onto a truck. The instruction was simple. Move them, do not read them, do not hide them. The stacks included school books, technical manuals, cheap novels, and party propaganda. For a moment, a cover slid sideways and revealed a Hitler Youth Field Guide with the familiar emblem. Helmut's fingers tightened, and the old reflex of pride tried to rise, immediately chased by nausea. He kept lifting. Nearby, Fletcher leaned against the truck, talking with another soldier in English, gesturing with a cigarette, sounding like a man already thinking about the next assignment, the next day, the next place. He did not look at the books as if they were evidence. He looked at them as weight to be moved. Helmut loaded the last bundle and stepped back, breathing smoke-cold air. The truck drove away with the books as if it carried nothing more than weight. Another loop closed, item collected, moved, stored, perhaps destroyed, perhaps cataloged. Procedure, not meaning. Nothing ended with thunder. The fear of imminent judgment drained away, replaced by mourning that belonged to him alone and an unromantic acceptance of survival. Helmut Krause, 16, former Hitler Youth member, moved through a system that treated his history as a non-essential variable unless it became a threat. The procedure did not judge him, and in its indifference it stripped him out of the grand story he had prepared to suffer for. What remained was a body that needed warmth and food, grief that refused slogans, and a damaged album that, for better or worse, had been returned to him with a code number and a signature. Dusk gathered each day over the ruins. Tomorrow would bring black bread and ersatz coffee again, perhaps another work detail, perhaps another line to stand in, perhaps another form to sign. Life, in its plain and stubborn way, continued.